In 1943, German soldiers digging trenches in a forest outside Smolensk stumbled onto something that would poison relations between half the world for the next 50 years. Thousands of bodies. Polish military officers, hands tied behind their backs, one bullet to the back of the head. Every single one, at almost exactly the same angle, like the people pulling the trigger had done it hundreds of times before. The Nazis said the Soviets did it. The Soviets said the Nazis did it. For the next 5 decades, an entire nation was forced to believe a lie, while the people who actually knew the truth carried it to their graves, because saying it out loud could cost them their lives or their children's futures. This is a story about how a government can keep not just its own people in line for 2 generations, but its allies too. It's about a piece of paper with 6 signatures that quietly erased Poland's future leadership. And it's about what happens when the truth finally claws its way out, 50 years later, and then, in one of history's stranger footnotes, comes back to haunt the exact same forest all over again. To understand why this happened, you have to go back to a single week in September 1939. Nazi Germany invades Poland from the west on September 1st. It's the opening act of the Second World War. Tanks, dive bombers, a military built for speed, crashing into a country that's still fighting with cavalry in places. Then, 16 days later, on September 17th, the Soviet Union invades from the east. This isn't a coincidence, and it isn't a rescue. 3 weeks earlier, in August 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Publicly, a non-aggression treaty. Privately, it included a secret protocol carving up Eastern Europe between them. Poland was never meant to survive this. It was drawn up, on paper, to be split down the middle before a single shot was fired. So Poland doesn't just lose a war, it gets erased and divided by 2 regimes that, on paper, had just promised not to attack each other. The Soviets take roughly 250,000 Polish soldiers prisoner during this invasion. Most are eventually released, exchanged, or drafted into forced labor. But one specific group gets pulled out and sorted separately. Around 22,000 men, funneled into 3 main camps: Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov. Who are these 22,000 men? This is the part that matters. They're not just soldiers. Poland had a system where educated professionals, doctors, lawyers, engineers, teachers, judges, were automatically enlisted as reserve officers. So this group isn't just a chunk of an army, it's a cross-section of the Polish professional class. Physicians, university lecturers, priests, landowners, police officials, people who, if Poland were ever going to be rebuilt as an independent state, would almost certainly end up running it. Which leaves Stalin with a fairly cold, practical question. What do you do with 22,000 people who are exactly the kind of men capable of rebuilding an independent Poland? A Poland that might not want to be a Soviet satellite. On March 5th, 1940, the answer arrives. Stalin and the full Soviet Politburo, Voroshilov, Molotov, Mikoyan, and others, sign a document known today simply as the Katyn Order. It runs less than a single typed page. It describes the Polish prisoners as hardened, irredeemable enemies of Soviet power, who should be dealt with by the highest measure of punishment, Soviet bureaucratic language for execution. No trial, no formal charges, no individual case files reviewed. 6 signatures on 1 sheet of paper, and a death sentence for 22,000 people who, as far as they knew, were just prisoners of war waiting to be processed home. Through April and May of 1940, the prisoners are moved out of the camps in small groups, usually a few hundred at a time, so nothing looks unusual. NKVD officers tell them they're being released or transferred to to a new camp closer to home. Some men reportedly pack their belongings, write goodbye letters to their families with an almost cheerful tone, genuinely believing they're finally heading back to Poland. Instead, they're taken to 3 separate sites. Katyn Forest near Smolensk is the most famous. It's where the massacre eventually gets its name. But the exact same operation is happening at the same time in Kalinin, at an NKVD facility, and in Kharkiv. The process at each site is grim in its efficiency. Prisoners are led, often one at a time, into a small room or directly to a prepared pit. Hands are bound behind the back. A single shot is fired at the base of the skull, close range, designed to kill instantly. Some accounts describe German-made pistols being used specifically because they didn't jam under heavy, repeated use. A detail that tells you this wasn't an act of rage, it was logistics. Bodies are stacked, layer upon layer, in mass graves. In the case of Katyn Forest, under stands of young pine trees, deliberately planted afterward to disguise the ground and let it heal over, green and unremarkable, within a few years. By the time the operation winds down in late spring 1940, nearly 22,000 people are dead across the 3 sites. And the Soviet Union simply says nothing. Not a denial, not an explanation, just silence. Families of the missing officers write letters to Soviet camp administrations, to the Red Cross, to anyone who might know something. No one answers, because officially, there's nothing to answer. The camps those men were held in have simply stopped existing in Soviet paperwork. The men have vanished without a trace, as if they were never processed as prisoners in the first place. For 3 years, nobody outside a small circle inside the NKVD knows what actually happened to them. Fast forward to 1943. The alliance that carved up Poland in 1939 is long dead. Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, and the 2 former partners are now locked in the bloodiest land war in human history. German forces occupying the Smolensk region get a tip from local residents. Something is buried in Katyn Forest, an area that had quietly become a kind of open secret among locals who'd seen NKVD trucks come and go back in 1940. German engineers start digging in early 1943, and they find mass graves, layer after layer of bodies, still in Polish uniforms, remarkably preserved by the cold, dry soil. What Nazi Germany does next is almost surreal, and it's worth sitting with, because it's not typical wartime behavior for a regime not exactly known for transparency. They invite in international observers, a mixed commission of forensic experts and journalists from a dozen countries, including neutral nations. They invite a delegation from the Polish Red Cross to independently examine and identify remains. They allow autopsies to be documented, photographed, cross-checked. And the physical evidence is oddly, damningly precise. Uniforms carry manufacturer dates. Letters and diaries found in pockets are dated. Newspapers stuffed into coat linings. People used to line their boots and jackets with newsprint for warmth, carry publication dates. Every single dated item recovered points to early 1940, which is a problem for the Soviet story, because in early 1940, this territory was firmly under Soviet control. The Germans didn't occupy this part of Russia until over a year later, in the second half of 1941. Naturally, Nazi Germany treats this discovery as a propaganda gift and broadcasts it aggressively across occupied Europe. Look what the Soviets did to your officers. But here's the genuinely uncomfortable twist buried in this story. The kind of detail that makes people uneasy even today. For once, in the middle of a war built on Nazi lies and staged provocations, this particular Nazi accusation happened to be true. The Soviet response is immediate, coordinated, and absolute. Moscow claims that German forces captured the Polish officers sometime after their 1941 invasion, used them for forced labor near Smolensk, and executed them sometime in the fall of 1941, conveniently placing the killings a full year after they actually happened, and squarely under German occupation instead of Soviet. And this is where the story stops being about one massacre and starts being about something much bigger. How governments protect a lie when the lie is politically useful to more than one country at once. The Western Allies, Britain and the United States, have their own intelligence on Katyn, and it doesn't point to the Germans. British officials, including intelligence officers embedded with Polish forces, report growing suspicion that the Soviet story doesn't add up. American officers held as German POWs near Katyn are given supervised access to the site by their captors, and privately conclude, in reports that reach Washington, that the Soviets are almost certainly responsible. But 1943 is not a moment for inconvenient truths. The USSR is absorbing catastrophic casualties fighting the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, effectively grinding down the German war machine that the Western Allies haven't yet opened a full second front against. Churchill and Roosevelt need Stalin's armies far more than they need justice for 22,000 dead Polish officers. So, quietly, deliberately, London and Washington shelve their own intelligence. Churchill reportedly tells the Polish government in exile, in private, that regardless of what actually happened, there is nothing to be done. The war effort comes first. The Polish government in exile, based in London under General Sikorski, pushes publicly for an independent Red Cross investigation, the same kind of neutral, international inquiry that had just examined the graves. Stalin's answer isn't cooperation, it's retaliation. The USSR severs diplomatic relations with the Polish government in exile entirely, accusing them of colluding with Nazi propaganda. A government representing millions of occupied Polish citizens whose own officers had just been murdered gets diplomatically frozen out for asking questions. The lie doesn't just exist in this story. It gets actively protected, reinforced, and defended by the very governments that were, at that exact moment, publicly fighting a war they said was about freedom and self-determination. After the war ends, the Soviets make one more attempt to formally attach Katyn to the list of Nazi war crimes. They try to introduce it as a charge at the Nuremberg trials in 1945 and 1946. It's a bold move, putting your own crime on trial and hoping the world convicts someone else for it. It doesn't hold up. The Soviet-supplied evidence is thin, contradictory, and doesn't survive scrutiny from the other Allied prosecutors. Even Britain and the United States, who'd spent years quietly sitting on their own contradicting intelligence, aren't willing to formally endorse the Soviet version in an international tribunal. The charge is quietly dropped from the Nuremberg indictment, rather than debated to a verdict, which is its own kind of admission, without anyone having to say so out loud. Back home in the newly installed communist Poland, the Katyn story becomes untouchable. State-approved history textbooks and monuments blame Nazi fascist invaders by name. Discussing the alternative, the true version, isn't just discouraged, it's treated as anti-state propaganda. Something that can get you interrogated, blacklisted from work, or worse. And yet, inside Polish households, the real story survives anyway. Passed down in whispers, from grandparents who remembered husbands and fathers who never came home, to children raised on an official history they were taught to recite in school, but never fully believed. An entire generation grows up holding two versions of the same event in their heads simultaneously. The one they're allowed to say out loud, and the one they know is true. Even in the West, the story mostly fades from public attention, buried under decades of Cold War priorities where nobody particularly benefits from reopening it. A U.S. congressional inquiry, the Madden Committee, actually investigates Katyn in 1951 and 1952, and concludes, based on the very evidence that had been sitting around since 1943, that the Soviet Union was responsible. But by then, the world has moved on to new crises, and the finding barely makes a dent. It isn't until 1990, almost exactly 50 years after the massacre, that Mikhail Gorbachev, in the final unraveling years of the Soviet Union, formally admits that the NKVD, not the Nazis, carried out the killings. 2 years later, in 1992, Boris Yeltsin's government goes further and releases the original execution order itself. Stalin's signature, in full, alongside the rest of the Politburo. The document that ends 50 years of official denial is 4 sentences long. It had been sitting the entire time inside a single sealed folder in the Soviet Communist Party archive, marked with an instruction that reads almost like dark comedy in hindsight. To be opened by the General Secretary personally, and no one else. Here's where this story takes a turn that almost feels too strange to be real. But it happened, and it's the reason Katyn still comes up in Polish political conversation today, not just in history class. On April 10, 2010, a Polish Air Force jet is flying a government delegation to Russia. The occasion? A memorial ceremony at Katyn Forest, marking the 75th anniversary of the massacre. On board is Polish President Lech Kaczynski, his wife, the country's military chief of staff, the head of the National Bank, members of parliament, and relatives of Katyn victims. Nearly 100 people in total, many of them descendants of the very officers killed there 70 years earlier. Attempting to land in thick fog near Smolensk, the same region as the original massacre, the plane clips trees on approach and crashes. There are no survivors. It's an almost impossible historical coincidence. Poland's leadership, en route to honor victims of a Soviet cover-up, dies in a crash near the exact same forest, sparking a fresh wave of grief, conspiracy theories, and diplomatic tension between Poland and Russia that, in some ways, hasn't fully settled even today. Official investigations on both sides point to pilot error, compounded by poor weather and pressure to land on schedule. But for a country that had already learned, the hard way, not to fully trust official Russian explanations about that particular patch of forest, the coincidence lands very differently. What sets Katyn apart from most wartime atrocities isn't the number of victims. By the horrific math of the 20th century, 22,000 is, awfully, not even close to the largest death toll on record. What sets it apart is that it wasn't hidden by the chaos of war. It was hidden on purpose, by a state powerful enough to out-argue the truth for 2 full generations. And it had quiet, willing help from allies who found a convenient lie more useful than an inconvenient fact. 22,000 people were killed for the crime of being exactly the kind of men who could have rebuilt their own country. And the lie about how they died outlived almost everyone who could have remembered them alive, surviving purges, a world war, a cold war, and the collapse of the very empire that told it, before finally, 70 years later, reaching back out to touch one more generation of the same families it had already taken so much from.